On a chilly New York morning in 2025, President Donald Trump stepped away from his security team and approached a homeless woman resting near Trump Tower. The media rushed to capture the moment, while social media buzzed with speculation, and onlookers raised their phones high, expecting yet another viral scene. But they were unaware of the photograph tucked in Trump's pocket, depicting a military medic in Afghanistan. They didn't know about the Spanish lullaby that had kept his nephew alive in a burning Humvee 3 years prior, and they certainly didn't realize that the woman in the worn military jacket was on the verge of transforming not only Trump's life, but also the lives of countless veterans across America. Some tales begin with a single step. This one began with an unpayable debt and a chance meeting that would astonish everyone, including the woman who believed she had lost everything but her determination to survive. Emily Martinez tightened her worn military jacket against the morning wind that swept through the concrete canyons of New York City. Fifth Avenue was beginning to awaken, with delivery trucks rumbling by and early workers rushing past in their polished shoes. No one looked at her directly. That was typical when you were homeless. People's gazes slid past her as if she were invisible. She hadn't always been invisible. There was a time when people admired her, respected her. Staff Sergeant Emily Martinez, combat medic with honors for valor, now stored in a unit she could no longer afford. But that was before Afghanistan, before the nightmares, before everything unraveled. Her spot near Trump Tower wasn't the safest or quietest, but it had two essentials: an overhang that shielded her from the rain, and a heating vent that blew warm air all night. Most importantly, it provided a clear view in all directions. Emily always needed to see what was coming. Old habits from her military days that she couldn't shake even 3 years after leaving the service. She glanced at her watch, a scratched but still functioning Casio that had survived 2 tours of duty. 6:45 a.m. time to pack up before the business crowd began to arrive. Emily had learned the hard way that lingering too long once the suit showed up meant facing security guards who were simply doing their job by moving her along. As she rolled up her sleeping bag, her hands trembled slightly. The dreams had been haunting last night. She could still smell the burning Humvee, hear Williams calling for a medic. Her medic bag had felt unbearably heavy that day, as if it was filled with stones instead of supplies, while she dashed through gunfire to reach him. Emily shook her head vigorously, forcing the memories away. She had a routine to maintain. Routine kept her grounded. First, pack up her bedroll and the cardboard she used for cushioning. Then, tidy up any litter. She was homeless, not messy. Check her backpack containing everything she owned: spare socks, a clean t-shirt, her VA paperwork that seemed to go nowhere, and her most cherished possession, a photo of her unit before that last patrol. She pulled out a granola bar from her backpack. Breakfast of champions. A kind woman at the shelter had given her a whole box yesterday. Emily had learned to make food last, breaking each bar into small pieces and savoring them slowly. It was better than 2 years ago when she'd been too proud to accept help. Pride didn't keep you warm or fed. She eventually figured it out. The morning crowd was starting to build. Emily observed them rushing past, clutching their expensive coffee and glued to their phones. Sometimes she wondered what they saw when they glanced at her corner. If they noticed her at all. Did they see a homeless person to avoid? A veteran who had slipped through the cracks? Or just another issue they wished the city would resolve? She used to be like them. Before everything went wrong, she had a life that mirrored theirs. A medical practice in Philadelphia, an apartment with a view, family who still answered her calls. But PTSD didn't care about your accomplishments or your plans. It just took and took until there was nothing left. The VA had attempted to assist. She had to acknowledge that much. But between the waiting lists for mental health care and the mountains of paperwork, she had fallen apart faster than the system could catch her. By the time her name came up for treatment, she had already lost her practice, then her apartment, and then her family's patience. Emily stood up, stretching muscles stiff from yet another night on concrete. Her back ached from an old injury from when their transport hit an IED. Just another reminder from her time serving her country. She had learned to live with the pain, just as she had learned to live with everything else. The sun was climbing higher now, reflecting off the glass towers surrounding her. Trump Tower shone especially bright, its golden facade catching the morning light. Emily had chosen this location partly because of the building's security. There were always guards around, which meant less trouble from the kind of individuals who viewed homeless women as easy targets. She noticed more security than usual this morning. The guards were communicating into their earpieces more, standing taller. Something was happening. Emily's combat instincts kicked in, and she began scanning the area more attentively. Extra suits by the entrance. A few more black SUVs than usual. The flow of foot traffic was changing as guards subtly redirected people. A news van parked down the block, followed by another. Emily's heart sank. Whatever was about to unfold would likely mean she'd have to find a new spot, at least for today. The media frenzy always brought additional security sweeps. She adjusted her backpack, checking its weight out of habit. In Afghanistan, her medic bag had weighed exactly 22 pounds. She had counted every item, knew exactly where everything was by touch. Now her entire life weighed less than that, and she still knew every item by heart. Crowd. The crowd on the sidewalk was thickening. More phones were out, aimed at the building's entrance. Emily stood very still, trying to blend into the background as she usually did. But something felt different about today. The energy in the air reminded her of those moments in combat just before chaos erupted. That electric tension that signaled everything was about to change. A young woman in a business suit stumbled on the sidewalk near Emily, dropping her phone. Without thinking, Emily stepped forward and caught the woman's arm, steadying her. Their eyes met for a moment, and Emily saw something she rarely encountered anymore. Recognition of another human being. Not pity, fear, or dismissal. Just simple acknowledgement. "Thank you," the woman said, genuinely looking at Emily. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed the military jacket. "You served?" Emily nodded, already stepping back, ready to fade away again. But the woman reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "My brother was in Afghanistan too. Call this number. We help vets find housing and work. Ask for Jenny." Before Emily could reply, the crowd's energy suddenly shifted. The security guards were moving with more determination now. The news crews were setting up their cameras. Something was definitely happening. Emily tucked the card into her jacket pocket. After so many disappointments, she tried not to hope anymore, but she kept every card, every scrap of possibility. Maybe someday, one of them would lead somewhere. The doors of Trump Tower opened, and the crowd surged forward. Emily stood very still, watching it all unfold. She didn't know it yet, but in the next few minutes, her entire life was about to change. Everything that had led her to this corner, every mission, every nightmare, every lost dream, had been leading to what was about to happen next. But for now, she just stood there. Another invisible person on a New York street corner watching the crowd surge forward, waiting to see what would unfold next. Her hands had stopped shaking. She realized, whatever was coming, she was ready. She had survived war, she had survived loss, she had survived the streets. She could endure whatever was about to happen next. Donald Trump stood at the window of his Trump Tower penthouse, gazing down at the growing crowd below. His reflection stared back at him from the bulletproof glass. Older now, perhaps a little weary, but still standing tall in his familiar dark suit and red tie. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, though he would never confess it to anyone. 2 minutes, Mr. President, his chief of security called from the doorway. Even years after leaving office, they still referred to him that way. Old habits died hard. He nodded, adjusting his tie one last time. Today's business meeting was crucial. Potential investors for a new project that could change everything. Something else nagged at his mind. A memory he couldn't quite place. Something about that corner down there where the crowd was thickest. His phone buzzed. Another message from his nephew Mark. The boy had changed since returning from Afghanistan 3 years ago. Quieter, more serious. The doctors called it PTSD. But Trump knew it was more than that. Mark had left something behind in that desert, something he never discussed. "Sir." His assistant appeared with a stack of papers. "The investors are waiting in the conference room, and the press found out you're here. They're setting up outside." Trump waved her away. "Let them wait." He pulled out his phone and looked at Mark's message again. "Uncle Donald? About that thing we discussed? The medic who saved my life? I think I found her. His hands tightened on the phone. For 3 years, Mark had been searching for the combat medic who'd pulled him from that burning Humvee. The one who had kept him alive until the helicopter arrived, then vanished into the chaos of war. Mark claimed he owed her everything. Said she'd sung to him while they waited for rescue, keeping him conscious through the pain. Trump looked down at the street again. At that specific corner, something clicked in his mind. A photograph Mark had shown him months ago. A female soldier with determined eyes and medals, standing beside a medical unit flag. He had seen someone who resembled her down there yesterday. But it couldn't be, could it? Sir, the investors, his assistant tried again. Cancel it, Trump said abruptly. Cancel everything. His security team snapped to attention as he strode toward the elevator. They had learned to read his moods over the years. And they knew that tone. Something was about to happen that wasn't in the plan. Sir, we need to sweep the area first, his head of security protested. The crowd already did your sweep, didn't they? Trump stepped into the elevator, his team rushing to join him. Besides, when do I do anything the conventional way? The elevator descended smoothly. Trump's mind raced. If he was right about who was standing on that corner, everything else could wait. He had seen too many veterans struggle after returning home, had attended too many memorial services, had listened to Mark's nightmares through too many family gatherings. The lobby gleamed with marble and gold, just as it always had. His security team moved into formation around him, earpieces buzzing with activity. Outside, the crowd pressed against the barricades that had been hastily set up. Trump paused at the doors. Through the glass, he could see her, the woman from the photograph. She stood apart from the crowd, observing everything with the alert eyes of someone who had learned the hard way to always know what was coming. Sir, his chief of security said quietly, whatever you're thinking. Sometimes, Trump interrupted, you have to trust your instincts. He straightened his tie one last time, and sometimes you have to repay old debts, even if they're not your own. The doors opened, cameras flashed, the crowd surged forward. And Donald Trump, disregarding his security team's practice formation, walked straight toward the homeless veteran who had no idea she had saved his nephew's life. Him. Behind him, his security scrambled to adjust around him. Phones recorded every move, but his focus remained on the woman in the worn military jacket, whose eyes had just met his with a mix of surprise and fatigue. Some debts, Trump understood, could never be repaid, but sometimes you could at least try. He took another step forward, and everything changed. Emily's combat training kicked in as she watched Donald Trump walking directly toward her. Her mind flashed back to another moment when everything had shifted. The day that had initiated her path to this street corner. It had been a beautiful morning in Afghanistan, just like this one in New York. The sun had been rising over the mountains, painting the desert in hues of gold. Emily had been checking her medical supplies just as she did every morning. 22 pounds of equipment that could mean the difference between life and death. Hey, Doc, Private Williams had called out. Think we'll see any action today? Emily had smiled, adjusting her helmet. Let's hope not. I like boring days, but it hadn't been boring, not by any means. The memory crashed over her as she stood on the New York sidewalk watching Trump approach. The crowd around them faded away, replaced by the echo of that morning in Afghanistan, the explosion, the screaming, the burning Humvee. Martinez! Her commander had yelled. Man down! She had run without thinking, her medical bag bouncing against her back. Bullets kicked up dust around her feet. The heat from the burning vehicle had scorched her face as she had reached inside, finding the wounded soldier by touch alone. He had been young, so young, blood everywhere, but his eyes had locked onto hers, full of trust. She had started singing to him then, an old Spanish lullaby her mother used to sing, keeping him focused on her voice instead of the pain while she worked. Stay with me, she told him. That's an order, soldier. The sound of cameras clicking brought Emily back to the present. Trump was closer now, his security team looking anxious as he broke protocol. The crowd had gone quiet. Phones were raised, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Emily's hands were shaking again. She pressed them against her sides, remembering how steady they had been that day in Afghanistan, how she had kept working even after the medical evacuation, treating 3 more wounded soldiers before finally realizing she had been hit herself. The injury hadn't seemed severe at first, just a graze along her back. But infections in the field were serious, and this one had been worse than most. By the time she had reached the field hospital, the fever had set in. They had sent her home after that. Medical discharge, honors and medals, and a pat on the back. "You're a hero," they told her. But heroes weren't supposed to wake up screaming every night. Heroes weren't supposed to flinch at every loud noise. Heroes weren't supposed to fall apart. She had tried to return to her former life. Her medical practice in Philadelphia had been waiting. Her family had been supportive at first, but the nightmares worsened. The flashbacks made it impossible to work. How could she treat patients when every time someone cried out in pain, she was back in that burning Humvee? The VA had placed her on waiting lists. "We're understaffed," they had explained. "Too many veterans, not enough resources." She had filled out forms until her hands cramped, sat in waiting rooms until the walls began closing in, called phone numbers that rang endlessly. Her savings had vanished into therapy bills. The practice had suffered as she missed more and more days. Her family's patience had worn thin as she pushed them away, unable to explain why she couldn't just move on. "You're different," her sister had said during their last conversation. The Emily we knew would never give up, but she hadn't given up. She had fought every day. Fought the memories, fought the system, fought herself, until one day she had looked up and realized she was fighting alone. The practice had closed first, then the apartment. Her family's calls had stopped coming. The street had seemed impossible. At first she had been too proud to accept help, too ashamed to admit how far she had fallen. Pride had lasted exactly 3 days in winter. After that, she had learned which shelters were safe, which soup kitchens had the shortest lines, which corners offered protection from the wind and a clear view of potential threats. Trump was only steps away now. Emily stood her ground, just as she had in Afghanistan. She might be homeless, but she was still a soldier, still a medic, still the woman who had run through gunfire to save lives. The young soldier's face flashed through her mind again. She had never learned his name, never knew if he had survived the chaos after the attack, the infection, the medical discharge. Everything had happened so quickly. She had checked casualty lists afterward, but without a name. She touched the VA paperwork in her backpack. Another appeal, another form, another attempt at getting help. The system was overwhelmed. She knew that. But knowing didn't make the nights any easier, didn't silence the memories, didn't warm the cold corners where she tried to sleep. Trump stopped directly in front of her. The crowd held its breath. Emily lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. She had faced worse than this. She had survived worse than this. His eyes were different than she had expected, kinder, almost as if he recognized her, which was impossible to him. She must look like just another homeless veteran, one of thousands who had served their country only to end up on its streets. But something in the way he looked at her made her pulse quicken, made her remember that morning in Afghanistan, the young soldier's eyes full of trust as she had fought to save him, made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, everything that had led her here, every mission, every nightmare, every lost dream had been leading to this moment. Trump opened his mouth to speak, and Emily braced herself for whatever would come next. After all, she had survived war. She had survived loss. She had survived the streets. She could handle this too. But she had no idea that what he was about to say would change everything she thought she knew about that morning in Afghanistan. No idea that the young soldier, whose life she had saved, had never forgotten her face, or her voice, or the Spanish lullaby that had kept him alive until help arrived. No idea that sometimes the longest road home could lead straight through a chance encounter on a New York street corner. The world seemed to shrink to this one moment. The crowd's murmurs faded to a distant hum as Donald Trump stood before Emily, his security team forming an uncertain circle around them. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. "That's a military jacket," Trump said finally, his voice softer than Emily expected. "Afghanistan?" Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir. 2 tours." She noticed his eyes catch on the combat medic insignia still visible despite the jacket's wear. Something flickered across his face. Recognition. But that was impossible. She was just another face in the crowd, another veteran who had slipped through the cracks. "Sir." One of his security team stepped closer. We should move inside. The crowd. Trump waved him off, his eyes still fixed on Emily. What unit? Said he. Whiskey, sir. Combat medic. The words came automatically, drilled into her over years of service. 45th Combat Support Hospital. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording every word. Emily could hear the news reporters speaking rapidly into their microphones, could see the camera crews jostling for better positions. This wasn't how her morning was supposed to go. When Trump asked which years, something in his tone made Emily's combat instincts tingle. This wasn't just casual conversation. He was looking for specific information. But why? 2019 to 2022, sir. Until she stopped, the memories threatening to overwhelm her again. The burning Humvee, the young soldier, the infection that had sent her home. Trump nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. Would you join me for coffee? The security team exchanged alarmed looks. This definitely wasn't in their protocol. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and more phones appeared, recording every moment. Emily's mind raced. This had to be some kind of trick, right? Things like this didn't just happen, especially not to homeless veterans on street corners. But there was something in Trump's eyes, an urgency, a purpose that made her hesitate. I don't need charity, sir, she said quietly, her pride still intact despite everything. Trump actually smiled at that. Good, because that's not what this is about. He gestured toward the building's entrance. This is about repaying a debt. I don't understand. Emily's hand tightened on her backpack strap. I've never. Please, Trump said, and something in his voice made her pause. There's someone who's been looking for you for a very long time. A news helicopter appeared overhead, its rotors drowning out the crowd's noise. The sound made Emily flinch, too similar to the medevac choppers in Afghanistan. Trump noticed her reaction, understanding crossing his face. Inside, he said firmly, gesturing to his security team to clear a path. Away from all this. Emily looked at the gleaming doors of Trump Tower, then back at her corner with its heating vent and cardboard bed. Everything she knew about survival on the streets told her to walk away. But everything she knew about being a soldier told her something else was happening here. Why me? She asked, needing to understand. Trump's eyes softened. Because 3 years ago, outside Kandahar, you sang a Spanish lullaby to a wounded soldier while you kept him alive. Emily's world tilted. The young soldier, the burning Humvee. She had never known his name, never knew if he had survived. How could Trump possibly know about the lullaby? The security team had created a corridor through the crowd now. Reporters were shouting questions, camera flashes creating a strobe effect that made Emily's head spin. But Trump just stood there, waiting for her decision. Me pino angel, Trump said quietly, pronouncing the Spanish words carefully. That's what you sang, isn't it? Emily's knees went weak. That was the lullaby, her mother's lullaby, the one she had sung to keep that soldier conscious, keeping time with it as she worked to save his life. No one could have known that, unless... Who was he? She whispered, though part of her was starting to understand. My nephew, Trump said simply. Mark. And he's been trying to find you ever since that day. The crowd's noise faded completely as Emily's world narrowed to this one impossible moment. All these years, all the nightmares, all the wondering if that soldier had lived, and he'd been searching for her. He's alive? Her voice cracked on the words. Trump nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. Thanks to you, he's more than alive. He's thriving, and he's upstairs right now, hoping to finally thank the medic who saved his life. Emily's hand went to her throat, finding her old dog tags under her shirt. She had kept them all this time, a reminder of who she used to be, who she still was underneath everything else. A gust of wind blew down the street, catching her worn jacket. The crowd was still recording, still watching, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. In her mind, she was back in that burning Humvee, singing to keep a young soldier alive, never knowing she was saving the life of someone connected to the man who now stood before her. Come upstairs, Trump said gently. Let us help you the way you helped Mark. Emily looked at her corner one last time. The cardboard and sleeping bag seemed to belong to another life now, but the weariness that had kept her alive on the streets made her hesitate. "Why now?" she asked. "Why like this?" Trump's answer surprised her. "Because Mark showed me your photograph months ago, but I didn't recognize you until yesterday. I walked right past this corner and didn't realize who you were. Weak. Couldn't sleep last night thinking about it." He shook his head. "Sometimes life gives you a second chance to do the right thing. This is mine." The news helicopter made another pass, and this time Emily didn't flinch. She was too busy processing everything. The impossible coincidence, the years of wondering, the chance to finally know what happened to that young soldier she had fought so hard to save. "Okay," she said finally, squaring her shoulders like the soldier she had never stopped being. "Lead the way, Mr. President." Trump smiled, genuine and warm. "After you, Sergeant Martinez. I think you've led the way long enough." As they walked toward the tower's entrance, the crowd parted like a sea. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. But Emily barely noticed any of it. Her mind was upstairs with the young soldier she had last seen bleeding in a burning Humvee, singing to him as she fought to keep him alive. She had no idea that this was just the beginning. No idea that this chance encounter would change not just her life, but the lives of countless other veterans struggling on America's streets. No idea that sometimes the longest journey home didn't end where you expected, but exactly where you needed to be. The doors of Trump Tower opened before them, and Emily Martinez, combat medic, decorated veteran, lost soul found, took her first step toward a future she never could have imagined on a morning that had started just like any other. Videos hit social media before Emily and Trump even reached the elevator. Dozens of phones had captured their interaction, but each clip told a different story. Some showed only the beginning, Trump approaching a homeless veteran. Others caught fragments of their conversation, but without context. Within minutes, Trump Tower and homeless vet were trending nationwide. "Look at this circus," Emily muttered as they waited for the elevator. Through the lobby's glass walls, she could see the crowd outside growing larger. News vans were double parking now, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Her hand went to her backpack again, an old habit when she felt uncertain. Everything she owned was in there, and it felt strange to be carrying it into this gleaming lobby with its marble floors and gold trim. The security team maintained a protective circle around them, but their expressions had shifted from alarm to curiosity. "Social media," Trump said, shaking his head as he checked his phone. "Everyone thinks they know the whole story from a 30-second clip." He showed her his screen, where a video of their interaction was already going viral. The comments scrolled past like rapid fire. "PR stunt. Who is she really? This seems staged. Why now? What's the real story?" Emily recognized herself in the footage, but the person they were all arguing about seemed like a stranger. Some called her a prop, others a plant. A few recognized her military jacket and defended her service, while others questioned if she was really a veteran at all. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. As they stepped inside, Emily caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, her worn jacket, her tired face, her weary eyes. She looked exactly like what she was, a homeless veteran who had been sleeping on the streets. No wonder people thought this was staged. Things like this didn't just happen, except it had happened, and now she was about to meet the young soldier she had saved, though he wasn't so young anymore. 3 years? Had it really been that long? "The media's going crazy," one of the security team reported, touching his earpiece. "They're demanding a statement, and Twitter is exploding with theories." Trump waved it away. "Let him talk." Some stories aren't meant to be told in sound bites. Emily closed her eyes as the elevator rose smoothly. Her mind flashed back to other moments when judgment had rained down on her. The VA waiting rooms, where other patients had stared at her with suspicion as her PTSD symptoms made her pace and fidget. The shelter lines, where some questioned if she was really a veteran because she was a woman. The street corners where business people clutched their bags tighter as they passed. "Having second thoughts?" Trump asked quietly. Emily opened her eyes, meeting his gaze in the elevator's mirror. "I've had nothing but second thoughts since Afghanistan, sir." "It hasn't stopped me yet," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. Mark was the same way when he first came home. The nightmares, the anxiety, the feeling that no one could understand. He paused. "Centurions. until he finally got help. The elevator continued to climb. On Emily's phone, which she rarely used except for emergency calls to shelters, notifications started buzzing. Old military contacts recognizing her from the viral videos, former colleagues from her medical practice, even her sister who hadn't called in over a year. She turned the phone off. Those bridges could wait. Right now, she needed to focus on the present moment, on keeping her breathing steady as the elevator carried her toward a reunion she'd never expected. Outside, news helicopters circled the building like mechanical birds. Social media continued its instant analysis, passing judgment without context, creating narratives without facts. Some called it a beautiful moment of human connection. Others searched for darker motivations, hidden agendas, political angles. The truth, Emily knew, was both simpler and more complicated than any of them could guess. It was about a morning in Afghanistan, a burning Humvee, and a Spanish lullaby. It was about survival, redemption, and the long road home. It was about second chances, not just for her but for everyone who'd ever fallen through society's cracks. Her dog tags felt heavy against her chest, a familiar weight that had anchored her through countless dark nights. They were proof of who she was, no matter what anyone else believed. No social media storm could take that away. The elevator slowed as it reached the upper floors, and Emily's combat training kicked in again, assessing exits, angles, potential threats, old habits that had kept her alive both in war and on the streets. They're going to want to film this, she said, suddenly realizing how this must look from a PR perspective. The reunion, I mean. Trump surprised her by shaking his head. No camera. No press. Some moments belong to the people who lived them, not to the world's entertainment. The elevator came to a smooth stop as the doors opened. Emily caught fragments of conversation from nearby rooms, staff members trying to manage the media frenzy, phones ringing with interview requests, the distant sound of helicopters still hovering outside. But none of that mattered as she stepped into a quiet hallway and saw a man standing by the window, older than the soldier she remembered, but with the same eyes that had once looked up at her with absolute trust as she fought to save his life. Mark. Trump turned, and the world's judgments fell away. In that moment, there were no viral videos, no social media debates, no public opinions to consider. There was only a medic and a soldier meeting again. Then, after years of wondering, hoping, and searching, some stories, Emily realized, couldn't be captured in a trending hashtag or a viral video. Some stories had to be lived, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, until you finally found your way home. Even if home turned out to be a place you never expected to find it. For a long moment, no one moved. Mark stood by the window, sunlight streaming around him while Emily remained frozen in the elevator doorway. 3 years of wondering, of nightmares, of not knowing, all of it led to this moment. "You still have your jacket," Mark said finally, his voice rough with emotion. Same one from that day. Emily touched the worn fabric automatically. Never could let it go. She studied his face, seeing both the young soldier she remembered and the man he'd become. "You look good. Healthy." "Thanks to you." Mark took a step forward, then stopped, seeming unsure. "I hear your voice sometimes, you know? That Spanish lullaby? It's what I focus on when things get dark." Donald Trump and his security team had stepped back, giving them space. This was their moment, their story. The helicopters still circled outside, and phones were still buzzing with notifications. But none of that seemed to matter anymore. "Me Pino Angel," Emily said softly, and watched Mark's eyes fill with tears. "My mother's lullaby. She used to sing it when I was scared. It kept me alive." Mark's voice cracked. "You kept me alive. Even when the pain was so bad I wanted to let go. Your voice gave me something to hold on to." Emily's training kicked in, assessing him automatically. The way he held his left side slightly differently, protecting old injuries, the familiar look in his eyes that she saw in her own mirror, the shadow of things you couldn't unsee. "The infection?" Mark said, gesturing to her back. "After you pulled me out, they told me later you almost died too." Emily nodded, surprised he knew about that. "Caught it in the field. Nothing compared to what you went through. You never came to see me in the hospital. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I waited, hoping to thank you. But by the time I was conscious enough to ask, you were gone." Medical discharge. Emily explained. They shipped me home before you woke up. I tried to find out what happened to you, but without a name. She trailed off, remembering endless hours searching casualty lists, hoping not to find him there. Mark moved closer, and Emily could see the medical team's work in the way he'd healed. Good surgeons, good care, everything she'd fought to get him to. I looked for you too, he said. Started with the medical unit records, but there was so much chaos that day. Multiple casualties, multiple medics. Then I found this. He pulled out his phone, showing her a photograph. Emily recognized it immediately. Her unit photo taken just weeks before that fatal patrol. She was standing proud in her combat medic gear, surrounded by her team. Uncle Donald, Mark gestured to where Trump stood, quietly watching. He has connections. We've been searching databases, asking around, but you disappeared. Emily finished for him. Hard to find someone who doesn't want to be found. Why? The question was gentle, but she heard the real meaning behind it. Why had she ended up on the streets? Why had she let herself fall so far? Emily looked out the window at the city sprawling below. PTSD is a funny thing. You can be the best medic in the unit, save countless lives, but when it hits... She shook her head. The nightmares came first, then the flashbacks. Couldn't work, couldn't sleep. The VA had waiting lists, months long. I know, Mark said quietly. Been there. Still am there sometimes. But you had family, Emily said. No bitterness in her voice, just a statement of fact. I pushed mine away, thought I could handle it alone. Pride's a dangerous thing when you're falling. Donald Trump stepped forward then, something determined in his expression. Tell her, Mark. Tell her what you've been doing these past 3 years. Mark's face lit up with purpose. After I recovered, I couldn't just go back to normal life. Not after what happened. Not after what you did. He pulled out another phone, this one open to a website. So I started something. A foundation for veterans, focusing on immediate mental health care. No waiting lists, no bureaucracy. Emily took the phone, reading the foundation's mission statement. Her vision blurred as she saw the name. Angel Watch Veterans Foundation. Angel, she whispered from the lullaby. We've helped hundreds of vets already, Mark continued, his dangry eye. But I always knew something was missing. The person who inspired it all. The medic who taught me that sometimes angels wear combat boots and sing Spanish lullabies. The room seemed to spin slightly. Emily felt Donald Trump's hand on her shoulder, steadying her. We want you to join us, Mark said simply. Not as a client, as a partner. Your medical training, your combat experience, your understanding of what vets go through. We need that. We need you. Emily looked between them. Uncle and nephew, power and purpose. A chance to rebuild everything she'd lost and help others do the same. The media is going crazy downstairs, she said, deflecting. People think this is some kind of publicity stunt. Let them, Trump said firmly. Sometimes the best things happen when you stop caring what others think and just do what's right. Besides, Mark added with a small smile, who better to help homeless vets than someone who's walked in their boots? Emily touched her dog tags again, feeling their familiar weight. In Afghanistan, they'd identified her as a soldier, a medic, someone with purpose. On the streets, they'd been a reminder of who she used to be. Now maybe they could be something else, a bridge between two worlds. The nightmares don't go away, she said carefully. The memories, the guilt, the things we've seen. No, Mark agreed. They don't. But maybe we're not supposed to forget. Maybe we're supposed to use it to help others find their way back, like you helped me. Outside, the sun had fully risen over New York, painting the city in shades of gold, just like that morning in Afghanistan. The helicopter still circled. The phones still buzzed. The world still spun with its own theories and judgments. But in that room, high above the streets where Emily had slept just hours ago, something was changing. Something was healing. Not just for her, but for every veteran who'd ever felt lost, forgotten, or alone. She looked at Mark again, seeing both the soldier she had saved and the man who had never stopped searching for her. Then at Donald Trump, who had recognized her when it mattered most. And finally at herself, reflected in the window, still standing, still fighting, still having something to give. And the next word she spoke would change everything. But she didn't know yet just how far those changes would reach, or how many lives they would touch. Sometimes the longest road home was just the beginning of an even greater journey. "Yes," Emily said, the word emerging soft but certain. "I'll do it." Mark's face broke into a wide smile while Donald Trump nodded with satisfaction. But before anyone could speak further, Trump's security chief stepped into the room. "Sir, you need to see this." He held out his tablet, showing social media exploding with a new development. Someone in the crowd had recognized Emily from her medical practice days. Her old hospital ID photo was spreading across the internet, side by side with her military service photo. The story is growing, evolving, taking on a life of its own. Emily Martinez. Trump read aloud, award-winning trauma surgeon, combat medic, with 2 tours, Bronze Star recipient. He looked up at her. "They're finding everything." Emily felt her chest tighten. Her 2 worlds were colliding. The respected doctor she'd been, and the homeless veteran she'd become. The contrast was stark, painful, real. "Let them," Mark said firmly, "let them see what war can do to anyone. Let them understand that the line between success and struggle is thinner than they think." But there was more. As Trump scrolled through the posts, his expression changed. "Emily," he said slowly, "did you know about this?" He turned the tablet toward her. There on the screen was a military briefing document, now declassified. Her name was there, along with details of that day in Afghanistan. But it wasn't just about saving Mark. The full report showed what had happened after. "You went back," Trump said, his voice thick with emotion. "After getting Mark to the medevac, after being wounded yourself, you went back into the field." Emily closed her eyes, remembering. "There were others wounded. I could still help." 3 more soldiers, Trump read from the report. "You saved 3 more lives that day, even with shrapnel in your back, even with an infection starting." He looked up at her. "His kiss. Why didn't you tell us?" "Because that's not why I did it," Emily said simply. "Any medic would have done the same." Mark moved to the window, looking out at the city below. "But they didn't. You did." He turned back to her. "And now I understand why Uncle Donald recognized you yesterday." Emily looked between them, confused. Trump sat down the tablet and walked to his desk, pulling out an old folder. 2 years ago, he explained, I received a military briefing about veterans issues. They showed us examples of exceptional service members who'd struggled after returning home. Your case was one of them. He opened the folder, revealing the same military photos that were now spreading across social media. "But they didn't give us names then. Just statistics. Just examples. I remembered your face but couldn't place it until Mark showed me his own file months ago. Even then, I wasn't sure until I saw you yesterday." "And now?" Emily asked quietly. "Now," Trump said, "we have a chance to make this right. Not just for you, but for every veteran sleeping on our streets tonight." Mark stepped forward, pulling up his foundation's website again. "We've been working on something bigger. A nationwide program partnering with hospitals to provide immediate mental health care for veterans, using civilian trauma centers to supplement the VA system." Emily's medical training kicked in, seeing the possibilities. Fast-track treatment, no waiting lists, direct access to care when it's needed most. "Exactly," Mark nodded. "But we needed someone who understood both worlds, military and medical. Someone who'd lived it from both sides. Someone like you," Trump added quietly. Emily looked down at her worn jacket, then out at the city where she'd spent so many nights searching for warmth and safety. The contrast wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every veteran who'd ever felt lost, every soldier who'd ever struggled to find their way home. There's more," Mark said, his voice gentle. "That briefing document? It wasn't just about that day in Afghanistan. It was about patterns of valor. They studied cases where soldiers went above and beyond, trying to understand what drove them." Trump picked up the thread. "Your case stood out. Because even after being wounded, even after saving my nephew, you kept going back, kept helping others. Even now, on the streets, other homeless vets said you looked out for them, shared what little you had, directed them to shelters and services. You never stopped being a medic, Marcus." Mark said softly, "Never stopped trying to save others, even when you needed saving yourself." Emily felt tears threatening, Inouye. For the first time since that day in Afghanistan, she admitted, "I didn't know how to stop." "Then don't," Trump said firmly. But do it with resources, with support, with a platform that can help thousands instead of dozens. He gestured to the city below, where news vans still clustered around Trump Tower. Those cameras down there? They're waiting for a story, but not the one they think they're getting. Not just about a chance encounter between a president and a homeless veteran. Tell them the real story, Mark urged. About service that doesn't end when the uniform comes off. About warriors who keep fighting even when the battlefield changes. About a medic who saved my life and can now help save thousands more. Emily touched her dog tags one last time, feeling their weight not as a burden now, but as a bridge between who she'd been and who she could become. The nightmares still lingered, but maybe they could become a foundation instead of a prison. Maybe every step of her journey, even the hardest ones, had been leading her exactly where she needed to be. Me Pino Angel, she sang softly, the old lullaby carrying years of memory and meaning. Mark joined in, remembering the words that had kept him alive. Even Trump grew quiet, listening to the song that had sparked a chain of events leading to this moment. Sometimes the longest road home was just the beginning. Sometimes rock bottom was actually a foundation. And sometimes a chance encounter on a New York street corner could change not just one life, but thousands. Emily Martinez, doctor, soldier, survivor, straightened her shoulders and faced the future. She was ready to help others find their way home. After all, that's what angels do. If you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe, and help us bring you more exciting stories involving celebrities. Here you will be updated every day on the world of celebrities. See you soon!